Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. You are back once again with the Economancer. Today, we're going to be diving into Chapter 5 of our series on W. Ross Ashby's Introduction to Cybernetics. This is going to be focusing on the concept of stability. So if you're new here, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon to stay notified for, updates on this journey as we keep going along with Ashby's Introduction to Cybernetics, and also to looking at the other stuff associated with my work in economics, public policy, cybernetics, communal ontology, and a little bit of theology. So let's just jump on. All right, so the key concepts for today that we're going to be going over is invariance, equilibrium, cycle, stable regions, disturbances. So in cybernetics, we often encounter a world of constant change, yet amid the ceaseless flux, there are aspects that we call invariants. And these are things that remain unchanged. You can think of this as like the bedrock of a river. It's steadfast as the water flows over it. Then we have the idea of equilibrium. So you can think of this as a balanced scale. It's perfectly balanced. No matter how you turn it, the balance remains. This is the state of equilibrium. So when transformation or change doesn't cause this state to alter, then the system stops moving, much like our balanced scale. And then a cycle. So on the other hand, this is a sequence of states, like the different stages in the life of a butterfly. If you apply the same transformation repeatedly, then the representation points towards this sequence again and again and again, creating this cycle. So imagine a field with a deep well in the center. So anywhere you roll a ball in this field, it eventually settles in the well. So this is what we would call a stable region. Even if the ball moves or is disturbed, it will always find its way back to the well. So in our context, a disturbance is something that displaces or moves the system from one state to another. And so this brings us to what we would consider stability under displacement. So if a system is stable under displacement, it means that no matter how much you disturb or displace it, it will always find its way back to its equilibrium, like a ball returning to the well. Something to say about this, when we think about this from economics standpoint, we have like transitory shocks, and then we have like full-on shocks. So you can imagine, like if you have your GDP graph, right, and it's going the straight line, and then we see like a dip like this, that dip, that's going to be one of two types of shocks. It's going to be one type of shock where, boom, you're no longer on that same path. You're obviously like below that path moving up, or you are moving back to that initial path, and then that temporary shock didn't really do much. And so that's really what we're thinking about when we're talking about, stability under displacement, or what displacement is. It can be a shock. There's an argument to be made that this disturbance is also something that we can align with like sin. So as we are moving towards God, we have this displacement, this disturbance that keeps us on a different path, or a different type of shock that keeps us from that path of moving towards God. Or even if we're still on the path of moving towards God, it's this fluctuation that keeps us just from this like straight linear line towards God. So not all systems are as steadfast as our ball in the field. There are some that exist in a state of unstable equilibrium. You can think of a pencil balanced on its tip. So the slightest disturbance and it falls over. Never return to its precarious balance that it had before. Because like, unless you're like jamming it in there, which somehow didn't break the graphite, but still, if you get it balanced, the one piece of movement, even a breath, is going to knock it over. And so it's out of balance. And this is what we would consider an unstable equilibrium. Then we have neutral equilibrium. So this is a state where the system retains its displacement. So imagine a marble on a flat table. You can push it and it will stop and stay wherever it is without returning to its original position or moving away indefinitely, right? And so that was what I was talking about when I'm talking about those temporary and transitory shocks to like the economic system, such as GDP. So it's crucial to understand that systems are typically stable given disturbances that lie within some range. So if a disturbance exceeds this range, the system may transition to a new state of equilibrium. So what this means is, if you're looking at a system and you see that it's stable and then it has a level of shock that it can allow, it's like, okay, well, this isn't enough shock to really move me away. I can move back to my system. A good way to think about this is the predator-prey model, right? There is a certain range of predator and prey that will always get back to this floating equilibrium between the two. But let's say there's an exogenous shock. Let's say there's a new animal that's there to kill the prey or the predator, right? So we've seen this in the United States, where we've taken wolves out of certain environments, and then those environments just had degradation to the system because it was outside of the level of disturbance that the system could allow. So it had to transition to a new state of equilibrium, which was deleterious to the overall ecology. Now, in certain cases, this may result in, positive feedback, where an increase in one variable leads to an increase in another. The important thing here to remember is that this doesn't mean that the system itself is unstable. It can still converge back to an equilibrium point, much like a seesaw. It's moving between these two. Again, think of the predator-prey model that you would do in like differential equations. As your prey increases in size, you're going to have a catch-up effect from your predators, as they're going to increase in size, right? And they're going to be eating the prey at a higher level, which is going to reduce the prey's population, which will eventually lead to the reduction in the predator's population. So this feedback effect keeps this equilibrium on this seesaw. So despite its constant movements, it's always returning to this horizontal state, which is one of the beautiful things about how we actually envision, or how you ought to envision, equilibrium in the economy, because it doesn't mean that the economy is like this flat, simple equilibrium point. It means that there's always a convergence to an equilibrium point, like the seesaw, which is what a lot of these anti-equilibrium or disequilibrium economists just can't comprehend about equilibrium economics, is that it doesn't hold to an equilibrium point. It holds to this horizontal state of positive feedback, where the system isn't unstable because it's always moving to a convergence point, even if it never reaches that point, like some asymptote. But another thing to think about is there are cases where, stability isn't desirable. Like, you can consider like a fire in your house, right? The stable system is the fire burning, but you don't want that system to maintain equilibrium, right? So the firefighter runs in there and douses the flame, and then it comes back because it goes back to its equilibrium point. That's an undesirable stability, because you want the fire to go out. All right, so equilibrium in part and whole. So let's consider this complex system composed of multiple parts, like a car engine. Suppose this whole system is in a state of equilibrium, right? Like your car's running and doing good. This doesn't necessarily mean that every component is at equilibrium as well. So each part has to be functioning in the conditions provided by the others for the entire system to be at equilibrium. So all of its components must be in a state that is acceptable to each other. And this is what Ashby refers to as a power of veto. No state of the whole can be a state of equilibrium unless it's acceptable to every one of the component parts, with each acting in the conditions provided by the other. So another way to think about this, if a single part of the system isn't happy with the current state, it can veto it, causing the whole system to move away from equilibrium. Now, when we think of this power of the veto, we're thinking about the checks and balances within the government, right? So suppose that the legislator passes something, you have the power of the veto that's given to the president. Says, no, we don't want this, and so it has to move back down, right? And then let's say it gets passed anyway, and now there's law on the books, it can go to another set of power of veto, such as the Supreme Court, which can also kick it back. Says, hey, this is unconstitutional. You either need to go through and amend the Constitution, or you need to stop this nonsense now. So there's always this power of veto within the systems. And the larger the systems, the harder it is to see the power of the veto, but it does exist there. Just really hard to see, because a lot of people see an individual within an organization. That makes sense. But when you have like this hierarchical relationships of organizations, like me as an individual, I'm not in the political system, right? My vote, my power of veto isn't to the political system. I have to have an organization or a system that can communicate with or across to that larger system, such as politics, before we can have these components of these multiple parts for the power of veto. So to sum up this, a state of equilibrium is a state that's unchanged by transformation. All right, so no transformation happens. Or let me say this again, if the transformation happens, it doesn't change the system. So there can be multiple states of equilibriums, stable regions, cycles, basins. Disturbances can cause displacement within the system, leading to movement back to an equilibrium or potentially to a new equilibrium position. So it's important to keep in mind that while equilibrium often implies stability, it doesn't always mean that it's desirable or beneficial. Again, we can think of forest fires in California. It's certainly not something we want to maintain, though I would probably disagree with that, but we can think about this from another way. So that's it for the lesson today on, stability. As always, if you have any questions, please leave them in the comment section below. In our next video, we're going to be moving on to our next chapter, and we're going to continue our journey into the captivating world of cybernetics and Ashby's work. Thanks so much for watching. And remember, the world is full of fascinating systems waiting to be understood. So keep learning, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next video.